What's going on, everybody? You're watching Too Long Didn't Read Filmmaker, where the answers comes first, the reasons come last, but we're constantly and always still learning. So you've already seen the thumbnail, you've seen the title of this video. Yes, I did pre-order the Sony A7S III the moment it was announced, and I wanted to kind of sleep on it a little bit after I watched the videos afterwards and then kind of collect my thoughts to kind of break down why did I get it so quickly, what features are important, and whether or not this camera is going to be the right camera for you and your overall budget and what it is that you do. So after thinking about it for a while, this is what I've came up with. The Sony A7S III is simply the best workhorse camera, a 4K workhorse camera that I have ever seen. This is something we were waiting for at least 4 years because the GH5 came out, the Sony A7S II came out, and if they just married together and had a baby, this is pretty much what we're looking at. So I believe this camera is going to be extremely relevant for creators for quite a while. Not only that, I also feel that this is the best hybrid creator's camera. So what do I mean by that? It doesn't matter if you just specialize in one thing, but if you're a YouTuber and wedding videographer, YouTuber and narrative filmmaker, wedding, like whatever combination it happens to be, or maybe you're all of that except for the YouTube, and I'll talk about that later. But if you happen to be a hybrid content creator like I am, where I'm dabbling in both, this also fits the bill extremely well. So without further ado, let's go into the reasons why, and then I'm going to break down whether or not this camera is going to be right for you. So in no particular order, Sony has finally given us full HDMI port. I didn't think that was going to happen. In fact, Canon went the other direction and went to micro, which is interesting, but doesn't matter. They finally went to a full HDMI. I love that, and Gerald Undone actually did a really awesome review that you should check out, but it does have an HDMI little lock screw thing that you can put onto it. That's awesome. Flippy screen, we've been waiting for that for a while. I know why Sony didn't do it, but I'm so glad they finally did it. And they also went the route of Panasonic S1H to ensure that your microphone cable and your HDMI cable doesn't actually hinder the angle of the screen. So that's awesome that they thought of that and didn't just kind of do what the GH5 did, where the HDMI was smack dab right behind it. So I'm really happy about that. 10-bit 422, for the most part, I've been working in 8-bit. In fact, you're watching an 8-bit video right now, and a lot of the films that we're filming on is 8-bit. There's only one specific movie that the team and I filmed that was purposely done in 10-bit for HLG on the GH5. So I'm really happy that we now have this ability for 10-bit because chances are my next personal narrative film is going to be shot at 10-bit, especially with the S-Log3 and S-Log2 that's already included. And the dual SD CFast Type A slots. This was amazing. I love that Sony basically chose these specific two types of media because they were able to combo slot each one, which means you're not forced to go CFast and SD or XQD and SD, what have you. You're able to use whichever one you want. And based on Gerald Undone's video, it seems like you can do a whole lot with just the SD UHS-2 or V90 cards, provided that they are fast enough, and that's good enough for me. It seems like the CFast Type A is probably more for photography, as well as if you're going into the S and Q modes where you're really ramping up those rates. We have a totally new menu system, which is awesome. I kind of sort of started figuring out the A7 III menu system, but I do still get lost in it when I'm looking for a specific thing. So I'm really glad that Sony has made that better. We do have RAW ability coming out of the HDMI, excuse me. And that's awesome. I don't see myself personally shooting RAW for a while, especially if the all-intra 10-bit 422 and S-Log3 seems to do well and everyone is exposing correctly on the set. But I do like that the ability is there. So if I do find myself wanting to do RAW in certain situations, I know I have that option. So I love that that's included. Also, just a side note, in terms of RAW coming out of the HDMI, this excites me because I think Blackmagic actually inserted themselves into a really awesome spot. So Obviously, their cameras are great, they're cheap, and they acquire awesome footage. But I've noticed that B-RAW actually is capable from the Ava 1 Panasonic, as well as the Canon C300, I believe, through Blackmagic's own external recorder, which tells me as long as a camera has an HDMI RAW output and they decide to, develop the B-RAW for that camera because everyone's using it, I think they basically are just going to be able to do that for any popular camera moving forward. So I wouldn't be surprised if the S1H as well as the A7S III will eventually get B-RAW through the external recorder from Blackmagic. So that's something I'm also thinking about. The dynamic range of this camera. Wow. Sony is saying 15 plus stops, or I think 15 stops of dynamic range. And again, Gerald Dunn did an awesome test where, yes, that seems to be true. But he also placed, not a limiter on it, but he wanted to say, well, how much of it is actually usable? Because some of it might just be noisy beyond belief, and you don't necessarily want to try to expose all the way down. So he placed the attribute or limiter, if you will, and he came out with 13 usable stops at dynamic range. I've never worked with a camera that has that many stops at dynamic range. Most of the cameras that I've used, I feel like I'm pretty much at 8 or 9, maybe at 10 at the most. So having 3 extra stops at usable dynamic range, or up to 15 if I literally expose it correctly and don't mind that little noise in the very, very deep blacks, that's going to be very, very interesting for me to work with. Not only that, he seemed to have discovered that even though it's not advertised that it has dual ISO, but it seems like an S-Log3 between 640 being the base, but he also noticed at 16,000 ISO that suddenly the dynamic range jumped back close to 13 and the noise and the shadows disappeared. That's pretty crazy. I've never shot at 16,000 ISO, but if I happen to be in a low light situation and I know I want to get cleaner blacks, I have 16,000 it is, I guess. And he also found that S-Log3 and HLG had the same usable dynamic range of 13. So that tells me if I don't actually want to grade anything, I might actually be shooting HLG more often if I want to have that extra dynamic range and using 10 bits. So I'm really happy about that. Lastly is the autofocus. The autofocus, he's discovered there's more variations of what you can do, as well as how to smoothly ramp between the two. Whereas on the A7 III, it's kind of just like, do you want it slow, fast, or medium? Do you want it responsive, or do you want it standard? It seems like there's a little bit more customization to do the rack focusing, especially with now you can touch the screen to rack focus between the two. Because the Sony A7 III, I've noticed I can't really do that, because if I tap the screen while recording, it goes into this little AF lock box, and it's not always what I want. I kind of want to be able to go back and forth. So that's definitely something I feel is going to help in terms of using a native Sony lens, and it might make me want to use the native lens more often. Okay, second to last thing, even though for me personally, I'm only going to be using 4K 24p, 4K 30p for YouTube, maybe I'll do 4K 60p, but having 4K 120 is definitely not bad. It's not something I would necessarily use, but in the reasons later about why I think this is a great camera for everything, it definitely comes in handy. Okay, with the reasons out of the way, now I want to talk a little bit about some questions that I think I might be getting, because we obviously have the Canon cameras, we have Panasonic cameras. So why did I specifically stick with Sony? And I think these are the arguments that I might be getting. So I kind of want to talk about it. The first one is obviously resolution. The A7S III is capped, if you will, at 4K. So some people might be asking, why don't you want 6K? Why don't you want 8K? Why don't you want an oversampled image down to 4K? What's the deal? So this comes in a couple different varieties. I think I have 3 different reasonings for it. So the first one is because it's a purposely built 12 megapixel sensor. The pixels are a lot bigger than, say, if they put in a 24 megapixel sensor. And because of that larger pixel, you're able to get more information. It's more sensitive. The processor doesn't have to work as hard processing 24 megapixels. It can just process the 12. And that's why Sony is able to pull so much out of this specific sensor. It's kind of like what RE does, where their sensor is so old, but it's backed by, an awesome cooling system, the processing, and a lot of DPs are still using the older, I think 2.5K sensors, I think. So Sony kind of looks like they've gone that route a little bit with the S line, which I'm totally fine with, because that's why we're able to get up to the 4K 60 with no crop, the 4K 120 with just a 1.1 crop instead of the Panasonic, which has a 6K sensor, that when you're shooting 4K at 60p, because it can't sample the entire 6K sensor and then make sure that you're still able to get 60p without a crop. And that was something that I know some people were saying, come on, really, Panasonic? Even I was kind of saying it, but I understand why. Because of the 6K sensor, the processor cannot keep up when you're going for the 60p, which some people might need to use. If you're just doing 24p and 30p, you're good to go, not a big deal. But then we get into the Canon area, where it's an 8K sensor now in terms of the R5. But the R6 is also guilty of this, and basically as the sensors have more and more megapixels, the processor needs to work harder and harder in terms of its current generation technology. Obviously, at some point in time, a camera that is 8K capable of internal RAW, there is going to be a processor jump in terms of technology, and it won't overheat at that point. But the 6K and the 8K sensors do have a compromise, and that's what the Panasonic has to do when you're going into higher frame rates, and the overheating that we're experiencing and from the Canon R5 and even the R6 to a certain degree. Those are compromises I'm not willing to work with, which is why I still say the Sony A7S III is a 4K camera with no compromise. You're literally able to do pretty much whatever you want while getting good image quality that's nice and sharp, as well as color information, what have you, seeing into the dark. So that's one major reason. Sensor technology, no compromise. So the second part of this whole resolution debate is the delivery format, because most of us are still delivering it in 4K. And I basically want to say we've done about 5 films now, all done in 4K, and we've premiered them at our local theater with sometimes we're doing the digital projection, so we had to make the DCI or DCP conversion. And sometimes the theater just has a regular projector and they have to use a 1080p Blu-ray and project it. So we're watching it on pretty large screens here. And there's 2 different types of audiences in that theater. There's our family and friends and a couple strangers that don't have anything to do with filmmaking. And then we have filmmakers. So assuming you filmed everything right, the story, the lighting, the camera movement, and giving them an overall experience, usually the non-filmmakers will say, wow, that looks like a real movie. It doesn't feel like a home movie. That was pretty good, which is the best compliment you can get from a normal person. But the filmmakers that are in that theater, whether they were on the team or not, the biggest question we always got from our team's Q&A was, what camera did you shoot with? And we'd say the GH5. And these are filmmakers that have actually shot on Red Dragons, RE, and of course GH5s themselves, and some budget cameras like the Sony A7S and S2. And that's very interesting that is always the question they ask, is what camera did you shoot with? They didn't ask what resolution did you shoot at. So that's something that I feel if a filmmaker doesn't care about what resolution you shot at, then generally speaking, a 4K sensor doesn't matter to them. Now, I totally get it. A 6K and 8K sensor, you're definitely able to kind of frame much wider, provided that the lens you choose gives you the look you want, so that you have the ability to stabilize, crop in if you have to, while still being able to deliver a 4K image. For us, we've been shooting at the 1:1 4K, or just a 4K in general. We've never really needed to punch in, and if we do, it's probably like 5%, 10%, just to give us a little bit of reframing. It's not something where we need to jump in 150%. So based on how we film, this is not a limitation for us by having a 12 megapixel sensor. So that out of the way, let's also talk about internal RAW, because that's definitely something that the Blackmagic's able to do, and of course the Canon R5. Now, don't get me wrong, the internal RAW coming out of the Blackmagic looks really good, and for the price of those cameras and the ability of shooting internal ProRes and internal B-RAW, that's a lot. But It's not something that I necessarily need. And of course, I need the IBIS, which I'm going to talk about in the next point here. But in terms of internal RAW, that's something that we just don't really do. We don't really use that. However, I will say the fact that what I talked about Blackmagic, how they've kind of more or less put themselves into a really, really good, I don't know, kind of piggybacking off of other cameras. If B-RAW does come in the external form, that might be something I'll be thinking about. But for now, shooting internal RAW is not something I need. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So when it comes to the IBIS, the Sony's IBIS is not as good as Panasonic. I'm willingly ready to admit that. But is it bad enough where it's not usable? And I have to say no. Because generally speaking, a lot of the IBIS tests that you see other people performing is them walking and trying to follow someone. With us working on narrative film sets, if we're going to follow someone, we're going to choose to use a gimbal. We're not going to choose to go handheld unless we're looking for that specific movement. How we actually use IBIS is for action sequences. And when I say action sequences, we're not running in and doing stuff. We're actually just kind of shifting our bodies, and our arms might extend, or in my case, I might start shuffling around quite a bit, as you see here. The GH5 IBIS is able to allow me to float the camera just enough where we're not getting into shaky cam territory. And the Sony does pretty much the same. So basically speaking, the IBIS, the way we use it, is going to do just fine. Or if we just need to get an additional shot and we don't want to set up a tripod or monopod and just have the person stand there still, the IBIS is more than enough for that. But when it comes to walking and following someone, if you're not needing the shake, then go ahead and use a gimbal instead. So that all out of the way now, let's go to the bottom line here of why am I touting this as pretty much the best 4K workhorse camera for many years to come. And like I said in the very beginning, because of its 4K ability and that 4K resolution, as well as if you're just framing everything right, you're gonna be fine. The thing is this camera can be thrown into pretty much every situation possible, and you're gonna be able to film it. Wedding filmmakers, you never know where you're gonna be. You don't know if the reception is gonna literally be lit with candle lights and the wedding party says, no, you cannot put your lights in here. It's gonna ruin the mood, it's gonna ruin my day. Well, with the Sony A7S III, you don't have to worry about that because you can jack up the ISO up to 16,000 if you're shooting an S-Log for this wedding, and I'm assuming you'll be okay at 16,000 ISO in a dimly lit reception hall. Not only that, there's no more recording limit. So if you are filming a wedding and you need to keep the camera rolling, you'll be good to go. There's no compromises there in terms of you having to start another file after 30 minutes. But not only that, because Sony did the combo SD card ports, you now can do your relay recording and keep it going indefinitely. And I'm assuming you're not shooting the entire wedding at 4K 120, where you potentially could overheat the camera after an hour. You're probably filming it at 60, most likely 30, unless you know there's certain shots where you want to hit the 60p and what have you. So pretty much as a wedding videographer, there's really no more limitations for you to capture every moment. And you got this awesome autofocus that also works in the 60p and the 120p. And you're capturing sound at the same time, unless you're in S&Q mode. So yeah, you're pretty much good to go. And same thing goes for a documentary filmmaker or event filmmaker, because generally speaking, you're probably not in control of a lot of the environment, and your job is to get in there and get the shots. Whether you want to shoot at 24, 30, 120, what have you, you're going to be able to do it in 4K, no problem. Now, as a narrative filmmaker, again, it's the same thing. You're able to get the S-Log3, S-Log2. You're finally able to shoot at 10-bit if you want to take advantage of that much dynamic range and really be able to pull the colors. And of course, the chance that eventually you're going to do external RAW if you need it, but there probably might be a chance for internal RAW at some point. Maybe they're just waiting for these CFast Type A cards to kind of pick up momentum, and then eventually they might give us internal RAW, which I would love if we are able to do that. But something tells me probably not. They're probably just going to let it be external. So In that case, from a cinematic standpoint, this camera basically does everything that I could possibly need. And I don't necessarily shoot 4K slow motion for the type of action stuff I do, but knowing that if I want to do that, 4K 120, still having autofocus, similar to the wedding situation, I'm glad to know that I can do it with no limitations except for a 1.1 crop, which is really not a lot. Now, if you are primarily a YouTuber only and you're doing other types of shows, is this a camera that I would recommend for you? And I would actually say no, and that's simply because Sony is hinting at another full frame camera, whether it's a completely new line, but we also know that eventually an A7 IV is going to come, and how many of these features are going to trickle down in here? Because the A7 IV will definitely be much cheaper, probably $2,000. Hopefully they don't bump up from that mark. And basically the two features that I'm looking for you as a YouTuber is the flip out screen, and whether or not the 10-bit 422 is available, probably in the 24p and 30p. It's probably not going to be there for 60p because that camera, again, is not necessarily meant for hardcore filmmakers. But if they do trickle down a lot of those things into the A7 IV, then the A7 IV is going to be an insanely awesome B camera to the A7S III. So generally speaking, I would say if you're looking for a YouTube camera, probably would want to wait and not spend $3.5 grand, or potentially you can also go to the A6400 and 6600, I think. They are about 1.5 grand. So, but that's going to be cheaper. And of course, there's other cameras you can get out there from the Sony lineup that gives you the autofocus, or potentially even some of the older Canons if you don't mind going down to 1080 or pseudo 4K. Okay, if the bottom line was good enough for you, then you don't have to listen to this next part because I'm going to be going into my think critically mindset to kind of give you guys an idea that it really doesn't matter what brand of camera you're really using. It really depends on your mindset of how you're going to be using the specific camera. So if you don't want to listen to story time with me as I go back to 2012 when I started filmmaking, then you're dismissed. But for the people that are still here, basically, long story short, before we go into the story, is I don't want to be limited by the camera. I want the limitation to be my ability to create and think about awesome shots. So each one of these cameras that I'm about to talk about, I naturally progressed my way up to the Sony A7S III. So let's get started. 2012, had no desire to be a filmmaker, but I bought myself a Canon T3i. I didn't have the Sigma 18-35 at that time. I just had the kit lens. And this was completely bought on a whim because I played with my friend's Canon T2i, really enjoyed just futzing around with the camera, pulling focus, and was like, wow, this looks just like a movie. So I was like, I kind of want to learn stuff because I didn't know what ISO did. I didn't know what shutter speed meant. I didn't know what aperture meant or what a lens aperture, focal length, pretty much everything. I was completely green. My understanding of videography was a camcorder that was aiming at something and I hit record and that was it. So this taught me everything. It taught me everything from camera settings, what focal lengths did, as well as editing and telling stories. I actually shot a couple mini documentary series with this thing, as well as my Christmas specials, a lot of the early ones. And it did well, and I thoroughly enjoyed using this camera. Until fast forward to 2014, is when the Panasonic GH4 was announced. At this point in time, I was actually saving up to maybe eventually get a Canon 5D Mark III, which was very expensive. But my colleague had a GH4 and he said, why don't you play around with it? And I actually took it on a little last minute commercial shoot for a friend. And literally it was the most run and gun thing. I had to come up with a story right there and then for their commercial. And this thing performed so well. It shocked me how well I was able to maneuver with it, get the shots I wanted, how good it performed in the ISOs compared to my Canon T3i, and also the fact that I only used one battery. When I shot the mini docu-series, I had to use multiple batteries for the Canon T3i. The focus peaking was great. It helped me out compared to the Magic Lantern hack that I had to do with the Canon T3i. And basically, this just felt way better to shoot with because it allowed me to do whatever I wanted creatively, whereas the Canon T3i, I had to think more about, well, there's limitations of the camera. I'm about to run out of batteries. What ISO can I don't have enough lights here. It seems like I know it's going to get basically the Canon T3i had limitations that this did not. And my brain could freely create without the camera being the problem. So that being said, it was a natural progression for me to move over to a Panasonic because it simply did what I needed it to do. And I went on to shoot my first major feature film with it, and it did great. Loved it. However, 3 years later, 2017, the GH5 gets announced. And at this point in time, I loved Panasonic and GH4, even thought about buying a second GH4, but GH5 was coming out. What did the GH5 have? The Panasonic actually hinted about IBIS coming to the GH5 because the G85 or GX85 had IBIS in it. So it was probably clear that the GH5 would have it. The moment it was confirmed that it did in their announcement, I pre-ordered it right away and paid full price. I didn't pay full price for the other two cameras at all. I waited until I could find one used. But the GH4 had a big limitation for me because at this point in time, I had invested in Rokinon prime lenses, which are fully manual, and there was no stabilization in here or on the lens itself. And knowing the certain shots we got from my film, if we had IBIS, we probably could have saved a couple shots because it wouldn't have looked so jittery when you're shooting at like 50 millimeters and stuff like that. So that was the limitation of the GH4. The GH5 solved that problem, making it an absolute no-brainer for me to move over. But it also did some more stuff that I didn't think about. At this point in time, I was starting to learn more about lighting. Knowing that this thing had a waveform in it allowed me to numerically see what the camera was actually interpreting the light, and therefore I could light everything and understand what it is that I was going to be working with as I got into editing. And of course, a bunch of other stuff, the dual SD card slots. The battery did take a slight hit, but not that bad. You can still get about 2 to 2.5 hours per battery if you're using it aggressively. And the 10-bit 422 that we eventually used on another movie. So yeah, it was pretty much a workhorse camera that I could count on, and the full HDMI was also a good thing too. So why did I buy an A7 III? Well, simply put, the movie that I'm currently helping DP with, the other DP as well as the director come from Sony cameras, and one of them does have a GH4, but that's besides the point. So I didn't necessarily want to be the one shooting with a GH5 and then mixing the color science, mixing the file formats. I wanted to be considerate. And I had already heard about the Sony A7 III. I even did a video about it. And I was like, it'd be nice for that project to use autofocus because of how we're actually filming it in the style of a reality TV series, and also just being able to see how it actually works. So I went off and bought a used A7 III, used a Tamron 28-75 on it, 2.8, and I have to say the autofocus is a lot of fun to use, especially even for YouTube, because I can literally hit the record button, come back here, and I'm good to go. It doesn't have a flipping screen though, so I do have to use the really, really bad smartphone app or just hit record, go back and see if I'm actually in frame, which is a limitation of that camera. And now that I played with the autofocus, it became clear that it is a tool that I can use. I've talked about it before, but now I actually tried it and I can use it. So the GH5 does not have autofocus, and there lies the limitation that the GH5 is not going to do what I need. And now comes the announcement of the Sony A7S III that I said in the beginning. It's basically a GH5 and a Sony A7, A7 III / A7S Mark II fused together, and it eliminates all my limitations from a camera. It's got a flippy screen, so I no longer need to pull focus with my smartphone app on my GH5 and then just make sure that I'm in frame with a flip out screen, because the A7S III now has a flip out screen. It also has the good autofocus, which I'm good with. I can see in low light now, whereas this one I could only go up to 1600, but I never really jack up the ISO anyways, but it's good to know that I can. I don't need to pay for Vlog in here, and the S-Log3 that's inside, now that it's got 10-bit, whereas like this had 10-bit, I can get 13 stops of usable dynamic range, or up to 15 if I don't actually mind the noisy shadows in those final 2 stops. It's 4K still, which means I'm fine because I normally shoot 4K anyways in these situations, as well as my narrative work. I have the ability for RAW if I want to. I don't usually shoot at 4K 60p, but if I had gone with a Panasonic S1H, I would have a Super 35 crop, which it doesn't matter to me, but it's good to know that I don't incur a crop if I'm shooting 4K 60, and that I only incur a slight 1.1 crop if I'm shooting 4K 120 if I happen to need it for my work. We now have a full HDMI, whereas this still uses a mini HDMI, so that takes care of that. Basically what I'm trying to say is it's the tool for me. It allows me to just be creative, and the camera is not going to limit me from my creativeness. So basically that kind of gives you a natural progression of how I went from Canon, Panasonic, and now to Sony. Now, if Panasonic creates a really awesome GH6 camera that's basically becoming a mini version of the Sony A7S III, and they don't play any games like they have with the S series, which now that I'm 2 years out from my videos, they're still great cameras, but Panasonic definitely decided to start playing games, and I don't like it. So if they come out with a GH6 that basically is a mini version of Sony A7S III, I'm going to have a question on my hands. Which one am I going to go with? And spoiler alert, I'm probably going to go and stay with Sony. And I talked about this in my previous video, because another limitation of the Micro Four Thirds system is not necessarily the lens, it's the lens adapters that are available. And whenever a new camera comes out, they don't necessarily do a whole lot with it, except for Metabones. They're like the only ones that do anything with their adapters. But even Shure, the 50mm anamorphic lens I have, it was specifically made more or less for the Sony E-mount. No questions about it. It was made for that camera system. And Micro Four Thirds was a complete afterthought, because on a Sony, you actually get the 50mm field of view. Here, I have to work with a 67mm field of view, basically rendering that 50mm lens not very desirable for Micro Four Thirds system. So that is a limitation of the Micro Four Thirds system, is that there are not a lot of lenses that are coming out, mirrorless lenses, that are made for it. Complete afterthought. And that's not something I want to deal with anymore. I want to know that lenses that are made is made for that camera. So that being said, that's all my reasonings of Think Critically and why I'm not brand loyal when it comes to the camera tools, because I don't want to be limited by the camera. So if you've stayed here for this entire little story time and you gain some value from it and why you would want to go with the Sony A7S III, I do have some pre-order links down below if you want to help support the channel. That would be awesome. But until then, guys, let's have some fun in the comments. Let's chat. What kind of stuff do you want me to test when I get the camera? I'm obviously going to be comparing it against the Panasonic GH5, but are you excited for it? Let's just have an awesome, fun discussion. And of course, like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you guys in the next one.